and hopefully I will say something that will be of interest. I'll dive straight in because I know we're running slightly behind. So, okay. So there are many specialists here today, PhD holders, experts in the detail. Where I come at this really, I'm a generalist in a reasonably niche field of forestry and land policy. I didn't start as a forester. I actually started in the concrete and steel of buildings and developed my career through asset investment and energy generation. I arrived in forestry in about 2014. Probably what I didn't realise at that point in time was just how involved I would become in the mechanics of forestry and hopefully in its development to make certain things run a bit more smoothly. Now, I'm hopeful that Confor is at least a familiar name to some of you. We are an organisation that's built around forests and their supply chains. So we provide support from seed to sawmill, and our passion is in promoting forests and wood. For our industry, I believe this is an amazing time. We're really fortunate in many ways. We've become fashionable. It's been a revelation to hear sound bites on the Today programme about tree planting before the previous general election, or dealing with grey squirrels, which, as any forester will tell you, is a real pet bugbear. But with that fashion have come some gifts, some dangers. And when something is fashionable, its popularity increases. You get die-hard enthusiasts, but you also get transient interested. It's quite difficult to plant a meaningful number of trees in the UK at the moment. And we risk some of that positive pressure because of that. We have a need to stop it drifting off to another topic, a window for action, if you would like. But we're at the start of that window for action. Now, just looking backwards for a moment, we've just passed the FC centenary year, 1919. The UK was covered in 5% of woodlands. Today, it's closer to 13%. So in 100 years, we've increased it by 8%. As a bit of a headline, we want to do 5% in the next 25 years. Now, previously, the scenario was when money and tax incentives were freely available, planting labour was high, there was no public consultation. Land was either being bought by investors or being turned over to the Forestry Commission on very long leases. So there wasn't a debate about the right tree in the right place, and this is important. So we've been here before, we've been here at mass planting, and we've got lessons to learn from that. Not all of it is new, and we have lost some of the capacity to deliver at scale. But I'd suggest predominantly in the public sector, and the private sector is really meeting that challenge. It's rising to grow into it. But the biggest change between now and then is probably within the landowner segment. So if we flip to today, and there's enormous political pressure on afforestation. In the run-up to the manifesto, in run-up to the election in 2019, we had Labour promising 300 million trees by 2025, Conservatives 30 million trees a year, the Lib Dems with 40,000 hectares per annum. When you actually sat down and looked at it, that was all sort of about 1 million trees plus or minus 100,000, sorry, 1 million hectares plus or minus 100,000 by about 2050. And this, as much as it's ever been, is serious political commitment. So if we scroll forward to spring 2020, Scotland's planted 11,000 hectares, England's mustered about 2,000, and Wales has mustered about 80. In 2021, Scotland's likely to exceed 12,000 hectares. England may get close to about 4,000, and the hope, I think the evidence suggests that Wales will hit between 1,000 and 2,000 hectares. But it is fair to say that at present we're still struggling to align political ideal with reality. I don't propose to debate the figures on the planting targets graphic. As you'll see from the slide, many organisations have put their stake in the ground. Confor is one of those. But the most recent figure from the UK Climate Change Committee is that we should be aiming for 1.5 million hectares by 2050. 5% land use change. Where's that going to happen? So I would say predominantly that's got to be on farm. As a brief overview of the policy environment that's intended to drive that change, my colleagues and I at the moment in Confor are currently helping our members respond to 3 basic payment replacement consultations across the UK. Like that's one of the gifts that Brexit combined with devolution has borne out. And these policies headline, they consist of the catchily named ELMS, which is the Environmental Land Management Scheme, the slightly American-styled SFL, which is Sustainable Farming in Our Land, and the slightly depressed-sounding SLUS, which is Scottish Land Use Scheme. I should add that Wales has just published an agricultural white paper that's also out for consultation. Now, these policies are evolving, and the consultation and pilot stages are still moving forward slowly. And there's no doubt that other external actors will have major continued influence on the development. At the launch of the UK, the 6th carbon budget, I was struck by a statistic on farming and pollution that was provided by Chris Stark as a rebuttal to a statement that farming was not the problem. 10% of the UK's emissions relate to farming. It forms less than 1% of the UK's GDP, and it covers 72% of the land use. Now, I'm not here today to bash farming, absolutely the opposite. But it remains clear that our governments feel that they can get a better return on investment in directing farms to tackle climate change. Couple this with the Oxford Farming Conference 3 weeks ago. We saw the Welsh Environment and Rural Affairs Minister, Leslie Griffiths, state quite categorically that whether they claim the new sustainable farming in our land payment or not, all farmers will be required to adhere to the new national minimum standards. So we're entering a new era of oversight and responsibility, and certainly I'm watching the policy with interest to see what this means for forestry. But whilst these policies have some pretty interesting differences, some different approaches, there are significant common themes. And public money for public good. So the status quo of funding a land payment is going to change. At the launches of the policy and consultation that I've attended, pretty much the first question that's come out of the mouths of most of the farming unions is, well, don't we already do that? We feed a nation, surely that's a public good. And of course, the resounding response has been no, that's got tangible economic value. Now, we don't yet have a clear understanding, though, of what the system for measurement and delivering public goods is going to be. There's immense potential in the digital catalogue of data that's provided to us. And in a recent conversation, an advisor told me that they were looking at signing up to a company who could provide twice daily imagery of the whole of the UK. So I think the fundamental thing here is the outcomes that we will achieve through all of this policy will be directly dependent on the quality and the validity of the advice that we use to catalyse them. So picture this, you're a landowner. Large one, small one, it doesn't necessarily matter. The twin crises of the global climate emergency and the decline in biodiversity are in the papers on a weekly basis. You know that BPS, which is the basic payment system, has its days numbered and its replacement still being debated. Due to Brexit and the complexity of that sport, you've just seen a shift in your market. And the European Eastern European and American markets are pivoting quickly to potentially take your place. And then society, the general public, simultaneously expects you to be saving the planet whilst failing to understand why milk needs to cost more than 49 pence a pint. Genuinely, I'm glad I'm not a farmer, that I don't rely on BPS. Hutchinson's agronomists released figures indicating that the profitability of an average farm in the UK is £450 per hectare per annum, of which £232 is made up of a BPS payment. In upland Wales, the profit drops to £170 per hectare per annum, of which £232 is BPS. And now we're asking farmers, estate managers, land managers to start talking in a different language, to seek value from their land, not just through existing agricultural farm gate outputs, but through previously unrewarded benefits such as habitat creation, biodiversity and connectivity, carbon management, water and air quality improvements, innovative farming techniques, and sustainable management of natural resources. Some of these are simpler than they sound as a concept, but remarkably turn out to be convoluted when it comes to implementation. And I suppose for me, it's really interesting to have the platform to talk to you about this, but I suppose those barriers, that change in language is only part of the picture. But to recap, the broad headlines on why tree planting uptake with landowners has not accelerated as we might have expected are that stakeholder and community pushback on planting and species choice causes problems in the application process, a complicated regulatory process and continued uncertainty about the outcomes of approvals, the permanence of land use, conflicting advice, financial impacts and cash flows for businesses, grant availability, risk profile for property investment, land availability, even just simple skepticism and unwillingness to make a decision until the dust of Brexit has settled are all factors. So how do we solve this? Now I wanted, I don't know if you recall those sort of lovely wooden jigsaws you used to get the sort of the puzzles that you had to put together, but this imagery will have to do. So for me, this is the real opportunity. I come at this from a practitioner standpoint, so I will apologise if my terminology is maybe not quite right. But the research that we see presented here today, your attendants, the researchers, scientists, policymakers and lobbyists, you're all actors in this process. The first part of the puzzle is that we need to understand change and human interaction with it. None of the farmers or landowners are incapable of change. They can all flex their land and businesses to provide different income streams. They're adaptable, they have to be. But as in any market, there are innovators, there are early adopters, the middle majority, late majority, and so on. So if there is a big change, what's needed to instigate it? And for me, I believe the next bits of the puzzle probably are good quality advice that's freely available at the point of access, flexibility in a legislative environment, and money. Because frankly, new investment and business diversification takes quite a lot of money. I suppose depressingly, I'm not saying anything new here. Land use policy, the documents that we covered earlier, all make various commitments to this in one way or another. So I could end this presentation here and sort of draw a line under it. But again, that's only half the story, because the first two, good advice and sensible legislation, are only easy if you say them quickly. Now, if you will, humour me for a moment. When you think about change in an industrial sector, I often ask people to visualise that sector as a balloon. You can squeeze balloons pretty tightly, they change shape, they bulge, they deform. So if we take that analogy a step further, we take our balloon and we start drawing forest outputs on it. And we can show it, we can use it to show how when pressure is applied in one area, it may shrink some outputs and conversely it will stretch others. My analogy is a simple one, but afforestation can deliver us several outcomes to a greater or lesser extent. What we need to do is to work out how to optimize that for different scenarios. But if you take a knife to that balloon and start trying to carve off the bit that's labelled carbon or the bit that's labelled habitat or the bit that's labelled timber, that balloon will burst. The roles we all play are in squeezing that balloon, twisting it, reshaping and seeing what happens. But we must stop separating the outcomes and studying them in isolation. Now, whilst the pictures are pretty and the validity of my analogy depends on whether you, what and where you write things on the balloon, the sentiment is sound. Forestry is full of integrated, interdependent outcomes. And this really brings me on to the crux of the problem. At present, the advice that farmers and landowners are subject to is often a little too one-dimensional. Common examples of this could be that conifer trees are the only financial viable forest product, or that mixed broadleaf planting is the most effective carbon sequestering tool. And the reality is far more nuanced. The current advice provided by bodies like BIFoR or Farming Connect is not yet robust enough for whole businesses to base their future upon. We can leave here today, go out for a walk, visit the forests, and we'll see that carbon in the form of timber has been harvested and is now locked into houses with replacement trees recycling and growing again. I can take you to another native woodland scheme. The squirrels are probably decimated, and the low yield classes mean that if those trees survive to their adolescence or senior years, they won't sequester the carbon promised. The same tale greets us when we talk about biodiversity or management techniques. And I'm certain that whilst many of the highly paid advisors to government departments and bodies like the UK Climate Change Committee have provided good, robust information to support the policy direction, there are definitely gaps between that advice and what's happening at a practical level on the ground. But one thing is for certain, the markets and their dependents are changing. We need to take the risk out of change. We need to put some certainty into choice, and we need to deliver good, clear, pragmatic advice. The difficult thing about forestry is that you can still see our mistakes. They're still growing. Those blocks of single species conifer planted in the 1970s are only now starting to be restructured and starting their journey to become multi-aged, diverse woodlands, but they remain easy targets to point at and decry. Sorry, my technology is not working quite well at this end. So I believe there's a case for change. The question is how to successfully achieve it. Now, I'm suggesting that we have a chaotic problem, the type where one element is compounded by another, and these combined influences produce a greater chain of events. So I've separated off what I believe are core issues. The ones that if we find a solution, the subsequent shift will bring other forces to bear on secondary problems, potentially dispersing them through things like market forces. So those core topics, stakeholder pushback, regulatory dysfunction, and conflicting advice, doesn't sound too bad. But the feedback from agents, landowners, foresters who form the membership that I deal with day in, day out, is that these topics are what turn them and their clients away from afforestation. The perceived lack of evidence or information to counter challenges, processes, or conflicting advice is still a major problem. What we as Confor, as a national manager for Wales, do is we try to help level that field. There is a belief that by delivering on the research to provide better information, advice, and certainty, confidence will develop to dissolve the other barriers, such as the permanence of land use or the risk profile of private investment, the land availability, because the market will become more appealing, less uncertain, the risks will be manageable. My deepest frustration is that in working with legislators, agents, government advisors, it's the days where we feel like we're working in the dark, where we're blind or we're wasting resources. So it is with some degree of envy that I look north of the border, but it is with some suspicion that I suspect, even with ministerial favour, the challenges that we see in England and Wales will develop there over the next decade too. So what am I actually asking for? I'm sure you're aware the UK Forest Science and Innovation Strategy has recently been released, and there are 7 major research themes. Out of this, there are 4 major strategic outcomes: improved evidence, increased knowledge and understanding, policy and practice, and skilled research in the community. These are broadly similar to the outcomes of the previous strategy, and they're broadly similar to what I've been talking about today. So again, I could finish, but I'm afraid I won't. Whilst preparing for this presentation, I've read all the proposals, documents from the Science and Innovation Strategy. I've met with some of the PhD students and other parties who will be involved. We have little shortage of research being undertaken. If I'm critical, I'd love it to be a bit more holistic, but there's always a challenge of wanting to collect more data. Where we need to develop relationships and invest is in dissemination of that knowledge. The work that's been done by Forest Research, for instance, in creating partnerships with universities and other research institutions has been vital. Whilst increasing public sector funding bodies and government departments are pooling their funding to tackle cross-cutting societal changes, there is a need to link practical, evidence-based guidelines on forestry operations, management and silviculture with landowner considerations. These cross-cutting themes of flooding, social benefit, financial resilience, welfare, we need to reach out. We need more institutions that we can create a bridge with. And there are still significant gaps in the knowledge at policy level and on the ground. Whilst organisations such as Confor have limited funding, there is a real desire and opportunity to partner and bring that knowledge and the fruits of that research into greater circulation. But there are also the unknown unknowns, if you like. The lack of a repository dedicated to forestry-related papers makes it difficult to reach out and contact academic partners. And I would very much appreciate your feedback and support on how the industry can become a better partner. We would love to see greater visibility of institutions' research and their outcomes, as well as developing the opportunity for industry-led research. So I'd like at this point just to introduce the Confor Biodiversity Report. I believe this is a really proactive first step in developing a toolkit to address some of the long-held and aired views about the different types of afforestation. This is not a scientific paper. It's an analysis of the available scientific research on biodiversity of wood-producing forests. This report seeks to present a coherent analysis of forestry and biodiversity. It's not the be-all and end-all, but it does take a pragmatic approach to responding to some of the age-old claims that hitherto there just hasn't been the information in an accessible format to challenge. So one of the personal standout elements of this report for me was learning about the transplantation of biological matter from existing woodlands to kickstart the development of new ones. For years in the Wye Valley, we've seen some tremendous cedar and Douglas fir sites that bear all the hallmarks of ancient woodland, and that's because they were planted on or adjacent to ancient woodlands. Whilst I don't recommend repeating the former, by sharing that knowledge on how to deliver additionality to new woodlands, we can create tangible benefit. Now, I'd encourage you all to read the report. Unfortunately, I don't get paid on subscriber likes, but interestingly, it's a good read. And more importantly, in the spirit of trying to deliver good quality information in an environment that contains the industry and ENGOs, it's been reviewed by people from Forest Research, by the Butterfly Conservation Trust, members of the School of Biological Sciences, Woodland Trust, Scottish Wildlife Trust. It's not an exhaustive list. It's also not scientific peer review. But importantly, it's not just a group of commercially retained forest ecologists. And there are some really good learning points to look at. There are examples where at present woodland management shows a strong priority for either wood production or biodiversity, with a substantial amount of forestry not managed at all. But too many of the analysis of UK woodland have presented ecology and profitability as competing alternatives, forgetting that wood production is a product of ecological process, and good ecological condition depends on funding. This report has presented evidence to show that we know a great deal more about biodiversity value in the UK than is generally appreciated, and how wood production can be an important component of conservation management. So for me, I will round up, but I will say I believe there are some really big questions globally that need to be answered in tackling climate change and ecology. But there are also some significant locally focused questions that we need to get to grips with. Is commercially motivated afforestation for landowners sustainable for landowners? And how do we bring more benefits and add value to it? These answers can only come through research and questioning and testing a hypothesis. And now we have the fun of mapping that across integrated land use, supply chain developments, and rapidly growing technological data collection. I suspect our future challenge will be in knowing what questions to ask, but we must share that information. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anthony. And we have some questions.